Year is not written in any chronicle. There is no recorded date for this battle, because it never happened. But imagine, just for a moment, that it did. A vast plain stretches endlessly beneath a restless sky. No cities rise on the horizon. No fortifications break the wind. Just open land, dry grass bending under invisible currents of air. On one side stands a formation that represents centuries of discipline. Thousands of Roman legionaries form a solid wall of red and iron. Shields overlap. Standards rise above the ranks. The golden eagle watches over men who have trained their entire adult lives to stand firm, no matter what comes toward them. Their armor is worn but polished, their movements synchronized. They do not shout, they wait. On the other side, there is no rigid line. At first the horizon appears empty, then dust begins to rise, then shapes emerge. Not infantry, not blocks of men, riders, hundreds, then thousands. A shifting fluid mass moving like a living storm. The Mongols have arrived. 2 empires, 2 systems of war, one built on structure, the other built on speed. And if they had met at the height of their power, the outcome would not be decided by bravery alone. It would be decided by philosophy. Rome did not conquer the Mediterranean world through chaos. It conquered through repetition, discipline, and an almost industrial approach to warfare. The Roman legion was not merely a military unit. It was an engineered organism. Around 5,000 heavily trained infantry formed its core, supported by auxiliary cavalry, archers, and specialists. Every soldier knew his position within a strict chain of command. Orders flowed downward with precision. Disobedience was punished harshly. Discipline was not encouraged. It was enforced. Roman soldiers trained relentlessly. They marched long distances carrying heavy loads. They practiced with wooden weapons heavier than real ones to build strength. They drilled formations repeatedly until movement became instinct. They were not trained to fight as individuals seeking glory. They were trained to function as a single body. Before battle, pila would be launched in coordinated volleys, heavy javelins designed to pierce shields and bend on impact, rendering them useless. Then the legion would advance in tight formation, shields locked, short stabbing motions with the gladius aimed at exposed torsos and thighs. Efficient, controlled, brutal. But Rome's true strength was not just battlefield tactics. It was sustainability. Roads connected the empire like arteries. Reinforcements could be dispatched quickly. Supply chains transported grain across continents. Fortifications marked borders. Even in hostile territory, Roman soldiers built fortified camps every single night. No matter where they were, they created order out of wilderness. And if a Roman army was destroyed, the state endured. After catastrophic defeats in history, Rome rebuilt. It adapted. It learned. Structure absorbed shock. Now look at the Mongols. They were born into motion. The steppe offered no walls for protection. Survival demanded mobility. From childhood, Mongol warriors rode horses. They hunted at full gallop. They learned to fire composite bows with deadly accuracy while moving at high speed. When Temujin united the tribes and became Genghis Khan in 1206, he transformed tribal warfare into something unprecedented. He reorganized society into decimal military units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Loyalty to clan was replaced by loyalty to command. Promotion was based on merit. Discipline was strict, but flexibility remained absolute. Each Mongol warrior often controlled multiple horses, allowing entire armies to travel extraordinary distances in days. They did not rely on long, vulnerable supply chains. They carried dried meat. They drank fermented mare's milk. They lived from their herds. Speed was their infrastructure. Their composite bows outranged many enemies. Their arrows could penetrate armor at distance. But perhaps their most devastating weapon was deception. Feigned retreats were executed with precision. An apparent route would lure enemy forces into pursuit. Formations would stretch. Discipline would loosen. Then suddenly, horns would sound. Riders would wheel around. Hidden flanking units would appear. Encirclement would close. And once encircled, few survived. The Mongols also mastered psychological warfare. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Entire populations slaughtered. News spread ahead of them like wildfire. Many surrendered without a fight. Terror became strategy. So now we return to the plain. The Roman legion stands firm. The Mongol cavalry spreads outward, never forming a static line. Arrows begin to fall, not in a single volley, but in continuous waves. Riders approach, release, withdraw, reposition. The Romans raise shields. Testudo formations form in segments. Discipline holds. Casualties begin slowly, then steadily. The Romans cannot respond effectively at that distance. Their archers lack the same mobility. Their cavalry, though present, cannot match the fluid maneuverability of lifelong horse archers. Hours pass. The Mongols do not commit to close combat. They circle, they probe, they test the Roman response. The Romans remain solid, but solidity becomes vulnerability when facing an enemy that refuses direct engagement. If the Roman commander orders a charge, formation cohesion risks breaking. If he holds position, attrition continues. The Mongols are patient. They are not seeking honor. They are seeking collapse. But here is where the deeper question emerges. A single battlefield does not decide an empire. If the Mongols destroy one legion, Rome can raise another. Roads allow rapid redeployment. Fortified cities create defensive anchors. The Mongols thrive in open terrain. But what happens when they approach walled Roman cities supplied by sea? What happens when winter disrupts steppe mobility? What happens when prolonged campaigns stretch their operational rhythm? On open plains, the advantage tilts toward the Mongols. Mobility plus range equals control of engagement. But inside a fortified Roman province, the equation changes. Roman engineering excels in siege warfare. Defensive walls slow momentum. Interior lines allow concentration of force. Rome fights wars of endurance. The Mongols fight wars of shock. One erodes slowly, the other overwhelms quickly. So who wins? If the battle is decided in a single massive engagement on open terrain, the Mongols likely hold the advantage. They dictate distance. They choose timing. They fracture formation. But if the conflict extends into a prolonged campaign within Roman infrastructure, supported by logistics, reserves, and fortified cities, Rome's resilience becomes decisive. In the end, this is not merely a comparison of weapons. It is a comparison of systems. Wind versus stone, mobility versus structure, shock versus endurance. And history teaches us something unsettling. Sometimes speed shatters strength before strength can react. But sometimes strength outlasts speed until the storm exhausts itself. If Rome and the Mongols had met at their peak, the battlefield would not simply decide a winner. It would reveal which philosophy of war dominates the world, the empire that moves like lightning, or the empire that stands like a wall. And perhaps the true answer is this. Whichever one forced the other to fight on its own terms would shape the outcome of history. But battles are not decided only by weapons or formations. They are decided by commanders, by adaptability, by the ability to read the field before the field reads you. A Roman general was not merely a battlefield leader. He was part administrator, part engineer, part politician. Roman warfare was calculated. Camps were positioned strategically. Terrain was studied. Supply lines were secured before engagement. Roman commanders preferred control. They preferred to fight when the odds were structured in their favor. They avoided unpredictability whenever possible. The Mongol command structure operated differently. Genghis Khan and his generals embraced fluidity. They divided forces across vast distances, sometimes separating armies by hundreds of miles, only to converge at precisely coordinated moments. Communication systems using flags, horns, and relay riders allowed synchronization that stunned their enemies. Where Roman warfare resembled architecture, Mongol warfare resembled choreography. Now imagine the confrontation expanding beyond a single battlefield. The Mongols begin raiding frontier territories. Fast strikes, sudden disappearances. Roman border forts report sightings of mounted archers appearing and vanishing like ghosts. At first, Rome responds the way it always has: reinforce the frontier, dispatch legions, secure roads, build additional fortifications. But here is the difference. Traditional enemies of Rome often sought decisive engagement. The Mongols do not. They avoid direct confrontation unless conditions are perfect. They stretch the Roman response thin, strike supply caravans, target isolated units, withdraw before heavy infantry can deploy. Rome is powerful when concentrated. The Mongols are powerful when dispersed. The psychological strain begins to grow. Roman soldiers are trained for discipline under pressure, but constant harassment changes morale. Sleep becomes uncertain. Marches become reactive instead of proactive. The Mongols choose when to appear. They choose when to vanish. Yet Rome adapts. It always has. Auxiliary cavalry numbers increase. Scout networks expand. Defensive strategies evolve. Roman commanders may begin avoiding pursuit, forcing Mongols to approach fortified positions instead of chasing them into open vulnerability. Siege warfare now enters the equation. The Mongols were not initially masters of siegecraft, but they learned with ruthless efficiency. Chinese engineers, Persian craftsmen, captured specialists, all were absorbed into the Mongol war machine. Catapults, trebuchets, early gunpowder weapons. Cities that once believed themselves secure fell in terrifying succession across Asia. But Roman cities are different. Many are supplied by sea. Many have multiple defensive layers. Roman engineering is not improvised. It is institutional. If the Mongols attempt prolonged siege within Roman territory, time becomes a factor. And time favors Rome. The longer the war extends, the more Rome can leverage its economic base. Taxes fund new legions, grain feeds armies, replacement troops are trained. Rome bleeds slowly, but it does not collapse quickly. The Mongols, on the other hand, rely heavily on momentum. Their campaigns historically thrived on rapid succession of victories. Psychological shock opens gates. Fear weakens resistance. But against a society accustomed to total war and hardened by centuries of invasion, terror may not function the same way. Roman culture glorifies endurance. Stories of survival after disaster are embedded in its identity. After Cannae, Rome did not surrender. After invasions, it did not dissolve. It rebuilt. So now the war shifts again. Imagine a large-scale decisive encounter after months of maneuvering. The Mongols have studied Roman patterns. They understand the rigidity of legion formations. They begin the engagement with overwhelming arrow fire, targeting officers, standard bearers, cavalry mounts. Roman shields absorb much of it, but fatigue builds. The Mongols simulate retreat once more. This time, a portion of Roman cavalry pursues cautiously. The Mongols split their force. One division continues retreat. Another swings wide, targeting the Roman flank. Dust clouds reduce visibility. Confusion grows. Roman discipline holds at first. Centurions shout commands. Horns signal repositioning. The legions attempt to pivot, maintaining cohesion. But here is the danger. Roman heavy infantry is strongest when facing forward in unified direction. Rapid multi-directional assault strains that structure. The Mongols begin striking from multiple angles, never remaining long enough for close engagement. The Romans cannot land decisive blows. Hours pass. Casualties accumulate gradually. Exhaustion replaces confidence. And yet, if even a portion of Mongol forces miscalculate distance and are caught in close quarters, the outcome reverses instantly. Roman heavy infantry in melee combat is devastating. If Mongol riders are forced into compressed terrain, hills, riverbanks, marshy ground, mobility decreases. Once pinned, they are vulnerable. This is the balance. On open steppe, Mongols dominate tempo. In constrained terrain, Roman discipline becomes lethal. The environment decides as much as strategy. Climate matters too. Mongol expansion historically benefited from favorable weather patterns that supported vast horse populations. Abundant grass meant sustained mobility. If prolonged drought affects grazing lands, operational capacity shrinks. Roman armies rely on agriculture and storage systems, less dependent on pasture mobility. Seasonal conditions could tilt campaigns dramatically. And then there is leadership continuity. The Mongol Empire was unified under powerful khans, but succession struggles historically fractured momentum. Rome, too, experienced political instability, yet its bureaucratic framework allowed continuity beyond individual rulers. If war lasts years rather than months, institutional stability becomes decisive. So we return again to the essential question, not who is stronger in a single clash, not who has better weapons, but whose system survives longer under stress. The Mongols are masters of rapid dominance. Rome is master of prolonged control. If the Mongols achieve early, overwhelming victories, shattering multiple Roman field armies before adaptation occurs, they could destabilize regions rapidly. But if Rome absorbs initial shock, fortifies strategically, and extends the conflict into drawn-out resistance, the Mongol advantage begins to narrow. Because speed is devastating, but speed requires space. Structure is slower, but structure endures. And in the silent pause before the final engagement, as dust hangs in the air and shields tighten once more, the fate of such a war would rest not simply on courage, but on which empire forces the other to fight outside its comfort zone. Beyond the battlefield, wars are not sustained by courage alone. They are sustained by systems that can endure pressure long after the first clash of steel. Rome understood this deeply. Its military power rested on an economic backbone that reached across continents. Mines in Hispania produced silver. Egyptian grain fed cities and legions alike. North African fields supplied steady agricultural output. Roads ensured movement of supplies regardless of season. When Rome mobilized, it did not rely on improvisation. Contracts were issued, supply quotas assigned, garrisons reinforced. Even distant provinces were linked through administrative reporting structures. Information flowed back to the center. Orders flowed outward. War was bureaucratized. That gave Rome something critical in prolonged conflict: predictability. The Mongols operated on a fundamentally different economic rhythm. Their early expansions were fueled by mobility and tribute extraction, rather than territorial integration in the Roman sense. Instead of maintaining heavy garrisons everywhere, they enforced submission through threat and rapid punitive expeditions. Tribute, artisans, and skilled labor were relocated strategically. Trade routes were secured not through static fortification, but through dominance of movement. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road flourished because caravans were protected by overwhelming deterrence. Their economy became one of circulation rather than consolidation. If Rome fights to absorb and administer, the Mongols fight to dominate and extract. Now imagine this war extending over several years. Roman merchants report disrupted trade in the eastern provinces. Caravan routes become unstable. Border settlements are abandoned. The Roman Senate or imperial court faces a dilemma: commit massive forces eastward and risk weakening other frontiers, or maintain distributed defense and allow Mongol raids to continue. Rome historically struggled when facing highly mobile enemies along extended frontiers. The Parthians and later the Sassanids had already demonstrated how cavalry-heavy forces could challenge Roman formations in open terrain. The Mongols would amplify that threat exponentially. Roman commanders might attempt strategic adaptation. Instead of relying purely on heavy infantry dominance, they could expand auxiliary cavalry recruitment from regions accustomed to mounted warfare, Numidians, Thracians, perhaps even steppe-adjacent peoples. Rome was not rigid forever. It evolved when pressured. Over decades, its army composition shifted in response to new threats. But adaptation takes time, and the Mongols specialized in exploiting windows before adaptation solidified. Intelligence becomes central. The Mongols were masters of reconnaissance. Before major invasions, spies mapped cities, assessed defenses, identified political divisions. They understood that internal fragmentation was more powerful than frontal assault. If Roman provincial governors were rivaling one another, if imperial succession disputes emerged, the Mongols would not simply attack, they would destabilize. Rome's political structure, though durable, was vulnerable to internal conflict. Civil wars had scarred it before. A Mongol campaign timed during a succession crisis could magnify chaos. Conversely, Rome's intelligence networks were not primitive. Scouts, informants, diplomatic envoys. Rome had long experience managing frontier diplomacy. It negotiated with tribes, manipulated alliances, and sometimes turned enemies against one another. Roman strategy might involve encouraging rival steppe confederations to challenge Mongol dominance, fracturing unity from the outside. The battlefield, then, becomes only one layer of the conflict. There is also morale. Roman soldiers were trained to endure, but prolonged inability to bring the enemy to decisive combat can erode confidence. An army built around structured engagement becomes frustrated when denied it. Mongol forces, by contrast, thrived in fluid uncertainty. Their entire doctrine centered on flexibility. Psychologically, they were accustomed to maneuver warfare at scale. But even Mongol armies required cohesion under central authority. If a campaign drags on without clear victory, if tribute slows, if distant commanders operate independently for too long, cracks can form. Empires built on rapid conquest often face strain when expansion slows. Momentum becomes expectation. If that expectation is broken, internal competition rises. Now consider geography beyond the open plain. Suppose Mongol forces push into Anatolia or the Balkans. Mountainous terrain begins to reduce cavalry advantage. Narrow passes compress mobility. Roman defensive doctrine historically excelled in layered resistance, fortified strongpoints, fallback positions, controlled choke points. In such terrain, Mongol maneuver becomes more complex. They could still adapt, but their dominance in wide, open maneuver would shrink. Alternatively, imagine the war shifting north of the Black Sea, into steppe-adjacent zones where mobility once again favors the Mongols. Roman supply lines lengthen. Infrastructure becomes thinner. Now the Roman advantage in structured logistics weakens. The deeper they pursue, the more they fight on terms closer to Mongol preference. War is no longer a single scenario. It becomes a series of shifting theaters, each tilting advantage back and forth. And then comes the matter of naval power. Rome controlled seas. Fleets projected authority across the Mediterranean. Mongol warfare, though formidable on land, was not originally maritime-focused. If Rome leverages naval dominance, it could maintain supply superiority and redeploy forces along coastlines faster than Mongol cavalry could respond inland. Amphibious reinforcement becomes a strategic counterbalance to land mobility. But the Mongols historically demonstrated willingness to experiment even with naval invasions when necessary. They were not doctrinally frozen. That adaptability complicates any simple conclusion. At its core, the prolonged conflict transforms into a contest of adaptation speed versus structural endurance. The Mongols adapt quickly at tactical and operational levels. Rome adapts methodically at institutional levels. If shock overwhelms structure before reform stabilizes, Mongols gain decisive ground. If structure absorbs shock and reorganizes effectively, Rome regains initiative. And beneath all of this lies one final unsettling possibility. Prolonged contact between the two might produce hybridization. Roman armies incorporating large-scale mounted archery. Mongol forces institutionalizing more permanent administrative governance modeled after Roman provincial systems. In that case, the war would not merely determine a victor. It would accelerate military evolution itself. Because when two advanced systems collide, they rarely remain unchanged. One conquers, or both transform. And if transformation occurs faster than destruction, the real winner may not be either empire as it began, but the new synthesis born from their struggle. If the conflict stretches into a decade, the nature of the war changes again. What began as raids and countermarches becomes something heavier, something structural. Rome begins to reorganize its eastern command. Veteran generals who have faced cavalry-heavy enemies study Mongol tactics carefully. Reports are compiled. Survivors describe how the encirclements closed, how arrows fell in waves, how feigned retreats shattered cohesion. Rome has always learned from defeat. Against Hannibal, it adapted. Against Parthian cavalry, it adjusted formations and support structures. Now, faced with the Mongols, Roman commanders might begin restructuring their armies more dramatically than ever before. Auxiliary cavalry numbers increase significantly. Horse archer contingents are recruited from frontier cultures. Defensive formations become more flexible, less rigidly forward-facing. Instead of seeking decisive engagement immediately, Roman forces begin constructing layered defensive zones, forcing Mongol cavalry to approach fortified kill corridors. Engineering once again becomes weaponized in new ways. Temporary wooden palisades appear along likely approach routes. Ditches disrupt cavalry momentum. Spike barriers limit flanking sweeps. The Romans cannot match Mongol speed, but they can shape terrain to reduce its impact. Meanwhile, the Mongols observe these adaptations. They do not blindly charge into fortified resistance. They probe weaknesses. They seek political fractures. Perhaps a Roman governor, isolated and ambitious, considers negotiation. The Mongols historically excelled at offering terms before annihilation. Surrender meant survival under tribute. Resistance meant destruction. Rome, however, views surrender differently. Roman identity is tied to dominance. Submission to an external power would be culturally catastrophic. That cultural rigidity could become both strength and vulnerability. If no Roman authority is willing to negotiate, the Mongols face a war that cannot be won through terror alone. Terror is most effective when enemies believe surrender preserves life. Against a society that equates surrender with dishonor, fear loses leverage. And yet, Rome's internal politics remain a potential fracture point. If heavy defeats accumulate, confidence in imperial leadership erodes. Rival claimants may exploit crisis. Civil conflict is the one scenario where Rome historically suffers the most damage. The Mongols would not need to conquer every province. They would only need to destabilize the center. If Roman legions turn against each other while Mongol forces remain unified, the balance shifts dramatically. But unity is not guaranteed forever. Mongol succession traditions often triggered fragmentation after the death of a supreme Khan. If a major campaign against Rome coincides with internal Mongol disputes, operational cohesion weakens. Generals may prioritize regional consolidation over coordinated expansion. The Roman system, though politically turbulent at times, is bureaucratically layered. It can survive individual leadership changes without immediate structural collapse. The longer the war continues, the more it becomes a test of imperial longevity rather than battlefield brilliance. Now imagine one final grand campaign. Not a raid, not a border skirmish, a massive convergence of forces. The Mongols, determined to force a decisive outcome, assemble multiple tumens into a concentrated offensive. Roman intelligence detects unusual movement across the frontier. For the first time, both sides commit overwhelming strength simultaneously. The battlefield is not a random plain, but a carefully chosen region, wide enough for maneuver, yet bounded by rivers and slight elevation changes. The Romans construct fortified staging camps. Supply wagons line the rear. Cavalry units are positioned more prominently than ever before. The Mongols arrive in layered formations, not rushing immediately, but testing response. The opening phase resembles previous encounters: arrows at range, probing attacks, mobility. But this time, Roman forces do not pursue prematurely. They advance slowly, shielded, protected by staggered cavalry screens designed to intercept flanking maneuvers. Engineers quickly construct field obstacles mid-battle, creating artificial choke points. The Mongols respond with coordinated multi-directional assaults, attempting to stretch Roman formations beyond their adaptability. Dust fills the air. Visibility drops. Horn signals echo across the plain. At a critical moment, a Mongol feigned retreat attempts to draw a Roman wing outward. But the Roman commander resists. Discipline holds. Instead of breaking formation, the legions anchor against terrain, refusing to chase. Hours pass. Casualties mount on both sides. The Mongols increase intensity, committing heavier contingents to force collapse. Some Roman units begin to strain. Gaps appear. Mongol riders exploit micro-openings with lethal precision. But once a Mongol detachment misjudges proximity and is caught near defensive obstacles, Roman heavy infantry closes in. Close combat erupts. And here, the nature of the fight transforms completely. In tight quarters, Roman training dominates. Shields press forward. Short blades strike upward beneath armor. Cavalry horses panic in confined space. Momentum stalls. The battle teeters. If the Mongols disengage and reset distance, they regain advantage. If the Romans pin enough riders in constrained zones, attrition begins favoring heavy infantry. Neither side collapses quickly. Instead, exhaustion becomes decisive. Days of maneuver have drained men and animals alike. Arrows grow fewer. Water supplies thin. For the first time, the Mongols cannot rely purely on rapid withdrawal. Too much has been committed. For the first time, the Romans cannot rely purely on static defense. Too much has been invested. And in this suspended moment between mobility and structure, the true difference between the empires reveals itself. Concluding, in a direct confrontation at the height of their power, the Mongols would most likely emerge as the victors. While Rome possessed extraordinary discipline, engineering, and the capacity to sustain long wars, the Mongols specialized in breaking powerful systems before they could fully adapt. Their unmatched mobility, superior mounted archery, and ability to control the tempo of battle would prevent Rome from forcing decisive close combat. On open terrain, the Mongols would dictate distance, exhaust the legions, and exploit weaknesses with precision. Speed, in this case, would overcome structure.